So thank you for joining our session today for using the Ways to Equity Playbook to promote equity for historically underserved students. So we want to acknowledge that our session is a part of Santa Clara County Office of Education, as well as the Inclusion Collaborative and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. I am Dr. Angela Birts. I am the founder and CEO of Birts Equity and Inclusion Solutions, and I am an equity consultant for Santa Clara County Office of Education.
Awesome. I'm Edith Mancera de Gonzalez. I'm the coordinator of diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the Santa Clara County Office of Education. So welcome. We are really excited, and hopefully you find this resource a great tool that you can take back to use within your school setting, within your school district or community that you work with. So before we begin, I wanted to start off with a Mayan greeting. So I'm going to say En Lakesh, and you're going to say Alakin. Okay, let's try that. Alakin. Alakin. En Lakesh.
Alakin.
Let's try that one more time. En Lakesh.
Alakin.
So how many of you have heard of that Mayan greeting? Ooh, thank you.
Okay.
Do you know what that means?
I am because you are.
Yes. So it's I am, and then your response is because you are, or I am who you are. So it's kind of a reciprocal greeting to also recognize that I am human, you are human, we're recognizing each other's humanity, and that's a really powerful greeting that the Mayan had in their community to be able to acknowledge, right, each other's presence, and in terms of also reciprocity, right? Okay, if I cause harm unto myself, I'm causing harm to you. If I cause harm to you, I cause harm to myself. Okay, so thank you. The next part is we wanted to know who's in the room. So if you can take a couple of minutes to kind of turn around and to greet somebody that you might not know or might have not come to the conference with. Why are you here? What is your role? What is your organization? And what brings you the biggest joy? So go ahead and share, maybe turn around or share with somebody next to you. Okay, so we're going to take a couple of minutes to do this, to answer these questions.
So in the chat, we ask you to also participate in this activity. And if you could comment and let us know why you are here, what is your role, what is your organization, and what brings you the biggest joy. So we invite you to participate as well.
And let's remember to also hold on to that, right? As we're engaging in work of equity, sometimes we're going to be asking you all, or sometimes we might be asking you, you might be engaging in really hard conversations, right? That often can turn kind of the mood in the room quiet a little bit, right? When we're looking at data and when we're looking at certain things, when we're looking at systems of oppression, right? When we're looking at historically marginalized communities, that can cause sometimes some anxiety, some sadness, right? To be able to acknowledge that. But let's not forget that there's always also joy in this work, right? And being able to change systems in the name of justice, right? For the students that we serve. And like Christopher Emden said earlier, right? Not just words, not just utilizing words, but actually taking action, right? And doing the work. So let's also hold on to that joy, right? That this work also brings for yourself, but for all of us together. So again, one of the things that we want to acknowledge to Equity Playbook, the resource that we're about to share with you, came out of a grant that was created from the CEPIP grant to be able to ensure comparable high academic achievement, right, for all students, creating equitable access for educational services and inclusion, to make sure that we are creating equitable treatment for all students. And though this grant has ended, Santa Clara County Office of Education is continuing to push this work forward and continuing to expand. And you'll be able to see a little bit about how we're expanding. We also want to acknowledge that the efforts of this tool, right, it took a whole community to be able to put this together. And in this slide, right, you're able to see there were many different experts that contributed to this work. Dr. Birts is one of them. We are very grateful for her words that she wrote on here to be able to create this tool, as well as many other organizations that we partnered with to create this tool, and we want to acknowledge them as well.
So we are going to begin by having you scan the code there to make sure you're able to assess the Ways to Equity Playbook. So if you want to go and do that, we'll reference it throughout the presentation.
You can also get it on the app, on the WebEx app. You can download it from there as well. And if you need a code, let me know, and then we can share that with you. But if you're able to scan, it might be a little small. It'll pull it up on your phone.
So in the playbook, we focus on 3 specific student groups: African American students, students with disabilities, and English learners. And we also want to recognize that there is an overlap with a lot of the focus that we hone in on to support our students. But the goal is to recognize that the 3 groups that you see there historically and traditionally have been marginalized and also faced experiences in school that really warrant for equitable systems and creative resources to make sure that they get what they need so that they can thrive. So to that end, we want to begin by defining equity. I'm sure many of you came here today with an understanding of what the term equity is, but I just want to briefly go over it. So in partnering with the National Equity Project to do the research and prepare for the Ways to Equity Playbook, we really adopted a definition that they have, and this may be emblematic of some of what you already know, but it simply is that each student receives what they need, when they need it, to thrive social, emotionally, and academically. So we've heard a lot about inclusion today, and that's what it's about, promoting inclusion for our students. It's also about removing the predictability of success, failure correlated with ethnicity, culture, racial, and social economic status, those social identities that came up in Shelley Moore's presentation that she alluded to. And it's about paying attention to the social and historical forces within systems. We have to acknowledge the systemic barriers that have existed for a very long time that sometimes hinder the performance of our students, and we will be remiss not to acknowledge that in this presentation or even in conceiving any type of equitable program or structure to support them. So let's begin here. Some of you have come here perhaps from an organization, a school district, a school site. We want you to think about equity in your socio-cultural context. So the question that we have for you all to begin the dialogue is, where are you on your equity journey? So all of you should have a handout with these questions, and I'll briefly go over them. What is your organization's working definition of equity? So we offered a definition, but how do you all define that based on the context that you're in? The second question we want you to think about and discuss in small groups is, how has your organization engaged in conversations about the meaning of equity? Also, who has participated in these conversations and who has not? And lastly, what are accomplishments you've had with your equity work, and what are challenges that you face? Well, we want this to be a warm-up to prepare us for some of the other conversations that we'll have specifically on the focus groups. So we're going to give you, to start with, about 5 minutes, and we'll circle around. But we encourage you to partner with a few people that you do not know and just introduce yourself and walk through these 3 questions. Fantastic. So we want to have a whole group discussion about some of the information you learned in your group and what you share for your personal experience as well. But we want to just jump to the question 2 there, because question 1 is embedded in there in terms of the meaning of equity. So we want to call on at least 2 or 3 volunteers. How has your organization engaged in conversations about the meaning of equity? And who has participated in these conversations and who has not? Okay. So if you can hear my voice, raise your hand. We're back to the whole group discussion. And we are seeking a volunteer or 2 to share your response to question number 2.
The idea, again, is to push each other, to learn from each other as well. So, any volunteers?
Thank you.
We can bring it to you.
So our school district has been working, and they actually have a formal definition that they worked towards. We have equity leads, 20 teachers that were that applied and were selected to be part of the equity team. They've been extensively trained, and then they're trainers of trainers on our sites. And they really worked together for a very long time. It took almost a year for them to come up with a working definition of what equity is. And a lot of work has been done around ensuring that our district understands what equity is, from board members all the way down to every member at our school sites. So we really are working towards embodying true definitions of equity, because until we all speak the same language, it's, that's where we need to start.
Thank you. So that's an example of a district where they've come together to start to do the work and have that conversation. We would love to hear from others also add that a first step in addressing some of the issues that the student groups face is being able to have a consensus on what equity is and how you'll drive it within your district, site, or county. Is there anyone else that would like to share? Either a definition or some work that your district has done thus far. Yeah.
From the county level, I don't need a microphone. Can y'all hear me? I got a really loud teacher voice.
We're online.
Oh, sorry. My bad. Okay. So we're from San Joaquin County Office of Education, and Lisa has helped coordinate equity training for first our county cabinet members, and then directors under that and teachers under that. So trying to start the conversation and then hopefully have it trickle down so that we can all come to some working definitions, I think. I think this was our first, I'm new to the organization, but I feel like this is our first kind of global effort in terms of bringing awareness to and making sure that we are incorporating equity into all that we do, because it's not just in one moment, it's in every moment when we are working with kids and professionals in education.
Thank you. We're going to continue.
I think too, with that second question, as I mentioned, I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator. So I'm doing a lot of work in regarding to the playbook and bringing this work into school districts. And when they say, yeah, we have an equity team or we have an equity group, oftentimes I'm like, share about how you came to the process. Who's sitting in those conversations? Who's sitting at those tables? Oftentimes, the people that are sitting on in those spaces are people who the system already worked for. So I'm like, do you have any students who were suspended, expelled, or families from those communities serving to get voice, right? Obviously, the system did not work for them. So how can you capture their voice? Because that's important data. If we're trying to change systems for students who it's not working for, right, what better way than to bring them to the table? So how do we do that as well, right? So that second question, right, about who needs to be there that is not currently there, right? And we need to hear those voices as well.
That's a great segue to the next part here. This is a slide. All right. So as we continue, we want you to know that the 5 key frames to help guide the playbook were systems change, and that is an approach to understanding and taking action to advance equities in the classroom, schools, district, and communities. We also focused on making it versatile and adaptable, and that is recognizing that it's not necessarily a playbook for you to have a checklist of saying that you've done everything, but it's to think about how can you leverage the resources and tools throughout the playbook to address. Often it could be strengths that lay at the organizational level of where you are, but other times it can be opportunities to advance equity. It also prioritized collaboration and shared leadership. So it's great when there are conversations that are happening at the district level amongst administrators and so forth, but as Edith said, it's also important to have student voice and parent voice a part of that conversation. And if we think about what does that look like in terms of inclusion, you want to invite those voices at a time of the school day or a time of the year where they actually could be in the room, right? So if we're thinking about families, if you want those voices and if you want students and so forth, it may not behoove you as a district or a school site to hold a meeting at the beginning of the day where people are working. It would be best or better served to have that in the evening session where you actually could bring out the people that you will want to capture. Otherwise, you'll have those same voices. So the collaboration and leadership is key, and the input that teachers will bring is just as important. The playbook also humanizes data. So you have a handout with information about a specific student group that we'll delve into shortly. And we want you to recognize, as we all know, working in education, that we're talking about individuals and lives, their lives. So there's a human care approach to looking at this data to say, You acknowledge where there are shortcomings, and you acknowledge where some students are not thriving or performing as they can based on some of the barriers that they face. But we also want to ground it and promote the idea that these students are multidimensional. They have different identities, and they do have stories that should come out in these conversations that we're having. So what do we mean by that? We don't want to look at the data and label a child or only look at them through the lens of where they're not doing well, but it's also saying that they're still coming to class or they're making the best efforts that they can, and they're struggling in these few areas, and here's how our district or our site take accountability of how we create systems to better support them. Lastly, one of the frames is targeted universalism. And the targeted universalism is essentially the focus on the groups that we are discussing today, and that is to be met for all students by focusing on how to achieve equity for these specific student groups within a particular context.
So when you open up the playbook, you'll be able to see that there is a table of contents, and kind of there's a lot of tools here. And we're going to talk about specifically some tools where some of us don't know where to begin the equity journey. For some of us, we've already gotten started. We're starting with a definition. For some of us, there's so much to do, we don't know where to begin. And again, the idea behind this resource is to give you an idea of where are you at currently, and different resources that you can utilize to begin and continue that work. So again, the equity approach is targeting that we are taking in this equity playbook specifically is acknowledging African American students, students with disabilities, and English language learners. But a lot of the tools here can be used for lots of different marginalized groups, not specific just to African American students, students with disabilities, or English language learners. You'll be able to see that we're going to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, which I know Christopher talk a little bit about it, talk a little bit more about it, social emotional learning, and universal design for learning. So those are a couple of things that we're going to talk about. This is a very powerful tool. So if you do have the app, I believe this is on page, I'm trying to, 14 and 15. This is what we call the on-ramps. So within the playbook, it was designed to really, using the metaphor of we're all driving to achieve equity within our school systems. And the idea is that we're all on a different trajectory to that equity journey. And in all full honesty and full transparency for me as a woman of color, right, sometimes we're not moving fast enough, right? So every day as I'm having these conversations, I, as a woman of color where I am, have to remember that I have to be patient because we're not all at the same place. But having those conversations also with other people and realizing like, hey, where I'm at, I'm ready to have this stuff changed, right, years ago, years and years ago. But we're here now, so let's try to what we need to do to move forward. And again, we're all on a different path depending on our context. So if you go to the next slide, Angela, thank you. So how do you use them? So the idea is that you look at the different categories, kind of, whether planning, whether you're team building, developing an understanding, coming up with a definition, okay, and right, again, taking that metaphor of we're all driving to one destination, right? Starting your engine, picking up speed, and then merging onto the highway to realize that when we're engaging in this work, it never ends, right? It never ends. We always need to be on a continuum of trying to develop and strengthen our systems.
So in continuing with that, we want you to think about this work twofold. It entails a mindset change just as much as it entails a systems change. And we could view this through the lens of bias, and there's a balancing act that has to occur. And so we want to just briefly define implicit bias. They are the attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So for instance, everyone has implicit bias, but people can work to combat these biases and develop new ways of thinking. So for instance, we don't want to assume that everyone is bought into eagerly going into a conversation around diversity or even equity, or even acknowledging where students are underperforming in their schools. Some people may have those conversations often, whereas others may not dedicate the time and attention that's needed depending on what roles that they're in. So it really entails rallying people together and acknowledging, what are your thoughts about equity? What are you seeing within our system? And who are you? What's your story? What's your motivation for getting up in the morning? What's bringing you to this job and this work? Because having these difficult conversations isn't always easy, but one way to route that is acknowledging that you could completely shift your mindset in terms of what you actually can accomplish. And that's one of the things with the playbook. It's meant to be work that's happened along a trajectory and not something that, as we mentioned earlier, you simply check the list off. So for instance, it may be sometimes difficult to see the value in having ongoing conversations around how you define equity, but there's value in it because you're bringing people together who may have experienced equity or the lack thereof equity in their own life, and bringing that to the conversation is important. This also entails systems change, and that's developing frameworks, structures, and processes to disrupt inequities. So we know, again, that these biases can change. And what do we talk about? Someone has to write a policy, a procedure, or a practice within an institution. And how you view, let's say, what behavior is, what's deemed appropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior, is going to directly impact that policy that you put in place. Well, if you wrote it alone or if you wrote it amongst a team where you aren't considering the demographic of students that you serve, whether their different abilities that they have, the behaviors that they have, and so forth, that very much could be a policy that penalizes one group or another that leads to disproportionality. So how do you do a referral system? If you experience children having difficulties in class and teachers have the autonomy to refer their students to the office to document the behavior that they're seeing. Well, what's on that referral? What's getting checked off that list? What's deemed as appropriate or inappropriate behavior? That is what a system change is, being able to acknowledge either it's working or it isn't working, and being able to adapt it to address the needs that students have. So I want to apply this to student groups and give you time to grapple with it. So let's focus on African American students first. I wrote the section in the Ways to Equity Playbook for the African American students. And we want you to think of it in terms of mindsets, attitudes, and beliefs. So here's a question to get you to think about what this means for you and your role in your organization. So think about this. In your equity conversations, how likely are you to specifically discuss African American students in your district, county, school, or school site? If you could raise your hand if you are extremely likely, please. Okay, I see some hands, quite a few. Very likely? See others, okay. Not sure? See, okay. Slightly likely? Not at all likely? I want you to just reflect for a moment on what those conversations have been to date around students. System policies and structures, it really is highlighting the data and what studies show about specific student groups. So some information that we see over and over again historically for African American students in the state of California is that students tend to attend schools in economically disadvantaged or low-income, racially segregated communities, be disciplined, suspended, or expelled, be chronically absent, and experience barriers to attending early childhood and preschool education, and experience bias and discrimination. So all of these factors at play a role in the experience that a student is having that impacts their performance. So you all have a handout, and there's a handout for African American students, and there's one as well for students with disabilities. So similarly, I want you to think about this question as well, and we'll break soon so you'll have more time to unpack these statements. In your equity conversations, how likely are you to specifically discuss students with disabilities in your district, county, or school site? Raise your hand if you are extremely likely. A lot of hands. Very likely. Okay, and for those of you joining us online, you could put that in the chat for us as well. Not sure. Slightly likely. Not at all likely. Okay. Additionally, there's data there on one of the handouts that you'll have for students with disabilities. and we'll get into that. Lastly, English learners. In your conversations, how likely are you to specifically discuss English learner students? Extremely likely, raise your hand. Okay. Very likely. Not sure. Slightly likely. Okay. And not likely at all. Okay. So there's variation in the room, but a majority of you have raised your hands to acknowledge that you are engaging in ongoing conversations. So this will make for some really good breakout work. So I want you to look at the handout that you have, and I want you to look at the top. So we want you to hone in more specifically on your equity journey as it relates to the student group that you're assigned to on the paper. And we want you to think about your reaction to the data with the questions that are there. So for instance, if you have the handout for English learners, there's a particular expert from research that's placed on the handout there if you happen to have that. And we have some guiding questions on the back for you to discuss.
And they're all different. That's the idea that each of you guys has a different kind of student group
Right.
to focus on. So go ahead and read it independently for a couple of seconds.
You need one?
Raise your hand, we can get one to you. And then when you're
You have a question? Yes.
talking to people around you.
You have a question? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm excited to look at the data. My question is there evidence in the data as you all presented where these groups intersect?
That's a great question. Absolutely. For instance, with students with disabilities, one of the things that we found that often some students who are English learners are also students with disabilities, yet they're sometimes mislabeled as well. Similarly, African American students, considering their behavior and considering the mindsets that people have towards some African American students, their behavior can also be mislabeled as students with disabilities. But beyond that, the different disabilities that exist for students from all different racial ethnic categories also tend to have some disabilities. That's a great question, thank you. And to help facilitate this process, if you have the handout for African American students, could you raise your hand, please, so everyone in the room know where you are? So if you want to work with some people who have the handout for African American students, there are some others throughout the room. How about if you have the handout for English learners? Just so everyone can see where you are. That's a slightly smaller group, so will you all mind working together, the three of you? How about students with disabilities? All right, so we're spread out a bit. So if you see a hand up for individuals who have the handout with students with disabilities, if you could join them. And we are going to begin by giving you about 7 minutes to have dialogue, and then we'll have a whole group discussion around what came up or what questions you have. So that was a great question. I do want to share that question with the group. So if you're in the group with students with disabilities, you are viewing data, and the question, what's your name? Andy? Andy poses that, what specifically are we talking about? What are these different disabilities that these students are being overrepresented as? And I think that's fair, and we don't have that information there, but that study does highlight and differentiate what the different disabilities that students have. Because I think understanding and unpacking that more is useful. How's everyone doing? We want to have dialogue around what you've talked about thus far. I know that we could go on and have more conversations, but we do want to open up the floor for you all to hear from one another. So the way that we'll do it, you could choose what you want to share, but if you could just nominate a spokesperson from your group that could share something that stood out to you all. It could be a response to the question or just a takeaway from the conversation that you've had. And due to our time, we'll only hear from 3 different groups, but we'll highlight the different student groups. So, 2. Yeah. So let's start with students with disabilities. If you had time to look at the handout and have a conversation, is there anything that you would like to share that came up in your group? I recognize there are multiple groups.
So our discussion was mostly around like question number 2 with the structural and systematic bias. And we talked about teacher credentialing programs, that as a special education teacher going through my credentialing program, I had all the same general education type classes in addition to my special ed classes, and my hands-on learning was spent both in a gen ed class and in a special education class, but that expectation wasn't the same for general education teachers. So I don't want to say that teacher credentialing programs aren't preparing them well enough when we're trying to move towards inclusion, but I definitely think they feel like they're lacking some tools maybe to be successful.
We discussed, and one named that we really like the term emerging bilingual, but we also discussed that some of the assumptions when we think about emerging bilinguals in language learners are that it is Spanish and English, and that there are so many other languages that our students are bringing with them, as well as thinking about that separation when we think of students need English language development, right? What about the students that are starting with English and only have English? What language developments do they get to participate in and engage in when we kind of separate the groups? Other things, am I forgetting? Okay, all right.
Thank you.
If you were in the group that focused on African American students, we'd also like to hear from you. Is there a spokesperson that was in the group that would like to share a takeaway or a comment from what you discussed? Okay.
Oh, that means I'm
You got this.
Oh, great. I was just saying it was over here. She was looking over there, so I was trying to help her. Great. So I think we talked about snap judgments being our implicit bias. And I think one thing that I really grapple with in this work is, harm that we have perpetrated against students. And what are those lasting effects when we have perpetrated some of this implicit bias on them?
These are really great comments. We are going to transition to talk about different strategies to think about within your district or school site. I do want to add something that I heard, though, this idea of generalizing, meaning you're working with a group of students, we're working on these changes, but how do we recognize the social identities that students bring, while also trying to cultivate an understanding that there are students who deal with unique challenges, but it's not always going to be the same. So the approach could be different, but you don't have to leave out a group to have that same approach. So the best way to think about that, when you effectively learn how to address issues that one group is having, you do develop the same process and the tools to then apply that approach toward working with another group. And I want to acknowledge that, because if you happen to be in an environment or a district where the student group that you're thinking about could be a part of the minority, sometimes our argument is it's only this percentage of students in our school. Why are we having these conversations? Why do we need these resources? But the true goal of inclusion is to reach students where they are and meet the needs.
So again, a couple of resources that we have on here, right? So what do we do, right? What do we do with this data, and what are some strategies can start implementing? And you heard these throughout the conference, right, over and over and over again, right? This idea of looking at everything through the lens of a systems approach, right? Utilizing universal design for learning, social emotional learning, and culturally relevant pedagogy, or culturally sustaining pedagogies. These are outlined in the playbook with lots of different resources, right? It summarizes a lot of the data regarding each of these frameworks and the importance of utilizing them. One of the things, we're not going to have time to define them, but one of the interesting things that I was just sharing with my colleague here is that when we go into school districts and do these works, for example, we go to the East Side, great in culturally sustaining or culturally relevant pedagogy, but I don't hear conversations about UDL, right? Then I go to Palo Alto, great conversations about UDL and co-teaching strategies, but not culturally sustaining or culturally relevant pedagogies, right? So the idea is that when we're thinking about intersectionality and when we're thinking about collecting data about students, we need to think about what data are we missing that is not reflective in what we have, and how do we capture students' intersectionalities? And I was sharing at my previous school that I worked at, our African-American students on paper data, great, 80 percentile in math. And then we're like, we dug deeper into that data. We realized we had a large population of Black students who were first or second generation Black students. They were coming from Nigeria or other parts of Africa. But then we looked at our students, our Black students who have been historically, born in the US, generations of families, they were struggling, right? So we needed to dig deeper into that data as well. What's going on in that data? What is happening, right? And what do we need to do about it, right? And also, again, looking at the intersectionality of our students. So again, looking at social emotional learning, UDL practices, culturally relevant, we have to try to figure out how do we look at all of it, right? To really focus on inclusive practices and focus on supporting all of our students within our system.
And the goal is to achieve a culture of belonging and inclusion. Within the playbook, there are some sample tools from Teaching Tolerance, Scholastic, and there are also different initiatives. Additional features we want to highlight in the playbook, the equity audits and assessments. That's something that I've done with a few clients. It's a great way to begin the conversation around equity. There are many in here, and one that I want to highlight is the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium Equity Audit. So that really is for administrators to think about their curricular offerings, from the visuals around campus, from bulletin boards to how information is disseminated within the school, keeping in mind the different language identities that families have. So there are some great resources, a glossary in there, as well as district case studies we encourage you to take a look at. So what's next? We are thrilled to announce that we have been working on enhancements to the Ways to Equity Playbook. The first one that we're almost finished with is the Supporting Early Childhood Education Learner. So think about everything that we talked about today. What does that mean for early learners? What does equity look like for them? What is providing that support? What does CRP look like for a young child? We'll also have an enhancement for supporting students with disabilities, African American students, and English language learners. And again, this is to include new models and tools that are relevant, and keeping in mind the pandemic and how strategies have shifted, and there are new ways to reimagine how we provide that support. So those enhancements will be out soon. All right, we're going to wrap up here, but does anyone have any questions for us now? And if you're online, please comment in the chat. Anyone have any last questions about anything that we talked about today? Okay, thank you for being here.
Thank you, and again, we hope that you utilize the playbook. If you need support, reach out to us.
Yes.
To help you in this journey. You are not alone. And again, we all are here in the name and justice of the students that we serve. And I thank you again. We've been thanking you so much, but really what you do is amazing, and we are really grateful for the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you.